Testing. Good evening. It is 6:01 p.m. on June 1st, 2021. We finally made it to June, and we're fastly approaching June 11th, past the bridge period, right? So I'd like to welcome our listening audience with WCBU, as well as our not chamber audience, but our not council chamber audience, but our Riverfront Museum audience, and thank the Riverfront Museum, its director John Morris, and its board for allowing us to have this special policy session. Our policy session is scheduled from 6 o'clock p.m. up to as late as 8 o'clock p.m. For up to 2 hours. And the policy session is designed to review the, what's called the interim recovery funds final rule. We'll get some guidance from the city manager on, from Washington on how we might spend this $47 million that will come to Peoria. So we're going to begin with a moment of silence as well as the Pledge of Allegiance. If you can please join me.
To the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
I'm going to read our COVID-19 public notice. In accordance with the bridge phase of the Illinois COVID-19 mitigation plan, limiting meetings to no more than 60% capacity, and the CDC recommending social distancing of at least 6 feet between persons, the City of Peoria is implementing the following for the special City Council meeting on June 1st, 2021, while complying with the spirit of the Open Meetings Act. The meeting is being held at the Peoria Riverfront Museum Auditorium. There will be public seating available for 30 citizens on a first-come, first-served basis. Members of the public and media are invited to watch through the YouTube live stream or on local TV channel 22. Thank you, channel 22. While public comment is available in person, the option to submit comments through the city clerk's office due to room capacity restrictions was also available, and any submissions will be read into the record. The agenda, minutes, and video podcasts of the meeting will be available online through the city's website. Madam Clerk, can you call the roll?
Mayor Ali.
Present.
Councilmember Allen.
Present.
Councilmember Sear.
Here.
Councilmember Graham.
Here.
Councilmember Jackson.
Here.
Councilmember Jensen.
Here.
Councilmember Kelly.
Here.
Councilmember Euler.
Here.
Councilmember Riggenbach.
Here.
and Councilmember Ruckriegel.
Present.
We have a quorum present, Madam Mayor.
Okay, thank you, Madam Clerk. Okay, Madam Clerk.
We are at regular business. 21-143 is a communication from the Mayor and Corporation Council with a request to approve the declaration of local state of emergency.
Can I get a motion? Councilwoman Jensen, Councilman Ruckriegel. Okay, all in favor signify by, do we need a roll call?
Let's do a roll call.
A roll call, thank you.
Mayor Ali,
Yes.
Councilmember Allen,
Yes.
Councilmember Sear,
Yes.
Councilmember Graham,
Yes.
Councilmember Jackson,
Yes.
Councilmember Jensen,
Yes.
Councilmember Kelly,
Yes.
Councilmember Euler,
Aye.
Councilmember Riggenbach,
Aye.
and Councilmember Ruckriegel.
Aye.
It passes unanimously.
Okay, Madam Clerk.
We are at the policy session. 21-144 is a communication from the City Manager and Finance Director with a request to hold a policy session on the coronavirus state and local fiscal recovery funds.
Okay, so I'm going to turn this over to City Manager, Mr. Urick.
Thank you. We're good. Thank you, Mayor and members of the council. We are going to run through some slides regarding the American Rescue Plan fiscal recovery funds. This was in your packet, but this is just some information that really takes the summary document for the members of the public and for the staff that are here this evening. There's a handout from the Treasury Department that was listed that was there. That we've put that is really covered in the slide deck as we walk through that. But then we have some other information that we'll include in this as well. The American Rescue Plan was signed into law earlier this year by President Biden after Congress passed it. It's a $1.9 trillion investment in trying to recover from the coronavirus pandemic. In that, they included fiscal recovery funds for state and local governments in the amount of $350 billion. Of that $350 billion, counties received $65.1 billion. Our own Peoria County received just a little bit over $34 million in that. The cities over $50,000 or 50,000 in population that are entitlement communities, of which Peoria is, received $45.57 billion. And then cities under 50,000, which are called non-entitlement communities, received $19.53 billion. Of that $19.53 billion, $742 million came to the state of Illinois to distribute. In the state of Illinois, there was overall, between state and local governments, there was $13.23 billion to be distributed. The state has received $7.5 billion from this pot of money. They have another $600 million from another pot that they've received. Local governments have received $5.68 billion. And as I mentioned, Peoria County has received $34 million, and the city of Peoria will receive slightly more than $47 million. There's also a number of other pots of money in this $1.9 trillion stimulus that are coming back that could help our community and many of our local governments or school districts as part of that funding as well. In addition, for public health purposes, there's nearly $47.8 billion for COVID-19 testing, contact tracing, and mitigation activities, $122 billion for elementary and secondary school emergency relief funds. And I noted that yesterday, as the state passed their budget, they adopted a $5 billion appropriation for schools throughout the state of Illinois as part of this funding stream. There's $26 billion for formula grants for transit, $8 billion for airports. There's a $10 billion capital project fund for states to try and carry out projects to support COVID-19 education and health monitoring. $7.25 billion for the Paycheck Protection Program, which was a forgivable loan program that came out last year, an economic development program with great success as part of the CARES Act. $15 billion for economic injury and disaster loan advance payments, as well as $25 billion for restaurants, bars, and other eligible providers of food and drink. And then shuttered venue operators like the Civic Center, there was $1.25 billion, in addition to a prior appropriation of $14 billion. So hopefully we'll be hearing very soon that the Civic Center should be receiving some funding through this grant, because I know that they've applied for that as well. There's $27.4 billion for emergency rental assistance, which we've talked about a little bit, that some of that money is rolling through the states and is coming down to help provide rental assistance to the communities. There's $9.96 billion for a homeowner assistance fund, which will help homeowners that are falling behind in some of their utility payments or mortgage payments. This will allow them some assistance. That money is coming straight through the Treasury Department. There's $5 billion to assist people who are homeless, $7.2 billion to reimburse schools and libraries for broadband internet access and connected devices. So there's a good pot of money to help improve broadband access in our communities. $50 billion for disaster relief, $300 million for assistance to firefighter grants, and $175 million to create a community navigator program to allow people that are looking for business loans to work with people that are hired to work in the communities to help navigate them through all of these pots of federal money that are out there and that are available. So there's 4 objectives as part of the fiscal recovery funds. And these 4 key funding objectives are to support the urgent COVID-19 response effort, to replace lost public sector revenue, to support immediate economic stabilization, and to address systemic public health and economic challenges. So those are the 4 key pillars that were built into the funding strategies that Congress and then ultimately the Treasury Department is laying out. Of that, they've identified 6 specific areas of funding and eligible uses of the funds. First, to support the public health response. Second, to address the negative economic impacts of COVID-19. Third, to replace our public sector revenue loss. Fourth, to pay premium pay for essential workers. Fifth, to support investments in water and sewer infrastructure. And last, to support investments in broadband infrastructure. So in that first eligible category of supporting the public health response, they talk about the eligible uses of the funds can be for services to contain and mitigate the spread of COVID-19. So they can be used for things, and this is not exclusive. If there are other items that we think would fall under this pot, or any of the pots that I'll talk about here in just a second, that we could make a good faith argument, I believe that then we could utilize those funds in that way. So this would include vaccination, medical expense testing, contact tracing, quarantine costs, capacity enhancements, and other related activities. For behavioral health services, it talks about mental health or substance misuse treatment, crisis intervention, and related services. It talks about payroll and covered benefits for public health, healthcare, human services, and public safety staff to the extent that they work on the COVID-19 response. Under the pot of money or under the section of the Act that talks about addressing the negative economic impacts, it says that we can deliver assistance to workers and families, including support for unemployed workers, aid to households and survivors of families with COVID-19 victims. We could provide small business support with either loans or grants or in-kind assistance and counseling programs. We can speed up the recovery of impacted industries, including tourism, travel, and the hospitality sector. And it also says that we can rebuild public sector capacity by rehiring staff, replenishing our state unemployment insurance funds, and implementing economic relief programs. The third pillar of eligible expenses is talking about replacing public sector revenue loss. And here they actually have a formula that I'll talk about here in the slide deck in just a second. Within this section of the Act, they talk about being able to ensure the continuity of vital government services by filling budget shortfalls. And the way that they do that is they calculate your revenue loss based on a counterfactual trend. So what they want you to do is to look at your last full fiscal year of revenue pre-pandemic and then calculate what 4.1% growth looks like over that period of time. And then you have to recalculate that every year at the end of December in order to calculate how much your revenue shortfall actually is. So there are some items that they've taken out of those calculations. For one, any federal monies that you receive, you have to take those out. If there's any intergovernmental money that you're transferring between funds in your organization, you have to take those out. You have to take out any utility revenues. So if you have sewer utility revenues or stormwater utility revenues, you have to take those out. You have to take out any refunds or other correcting transactions. And then you have to take out any debt issuance costs or expenses that you've incurred. And then this was an interesting one. The only other point is that if there's any liquor store revenues that you have to take those out as well. So the finance, what's in is basically everything else that's included is in there. So taxes, fees, other fees that we may have that are generated by our underlying economy, as well as our component units. So with that, we did a calculation of what our revenues look like from 2019. And we took out all of the requirements of what we had to take out of those revenues. And in 2019, our base revenues, based upon what the federal government was calculating, was $169.9 million. So then that number grows by 4.1% through the year, through December 31st of 2024. And so what you have to do is you have to take a snapshot of looking at what that looks like every year at that period of time to determine how much under this section of the Act you can spend. And so for 2020, when we looked at our actual spend for 2020, the extent of our revenue loss was $18.1 million from what was anticipated to be the counterfactual growth of revenue of 176.9. So that means that under this initial calculation, and this is just an initial calculation, we'll have to tighten this up and make sure that it's fully correct, that we could spend in this section of the Act up to $18 million on just the lost revenue from the first year of revenue from the city of Peoria. Looking at the budget for 2021, which is that next number is of actual revenues, actually the budgeted revenues from 2021 of $162.4 million, you'll see that with the revenue growth number growing another 4%, that means that we'd have almost $21 million in 2021. Now, I think, and the finance director can corroborate with me on this one, that I think our revenues are going to come in stronger than we anticipated for 2021, which is good news. So that number may not be as large as we look at that. And we won't be able to take that calculation until December 31 of 2021. So we have time yet until we have to make that calculation. But this is the methodology of how we have to go about calculating what our lost revenue looks like. So what can this be spent on? Well, it can be spent on government services. So it's those services that we provide directly to our citizens. It can be spent on our pay-as-you-go infrastructure, which is a lot of what we do in our capital budget, is pay-as-you-go infrastructure. It can be used for cybersecurity and healthcare and for public safety expenses. So those are all allowable expenses under the Act. What isn't allowed? Well, what's not allowed is it's not allowed to be used on the principal or interest payments for debt service, and we can't use it to put these grant funds into our reserves or rainy day funds. So we can't put these into our reserves and put those aside. That doesn't mean we can't put other revenues of our own generation into our reserves, but we can't put the federal dollars into those reserves. The next pot of money is premium pay for essential workers. And what Congress envisioned here and that was put into the Act is that we would be able to provide premium pay to essential workers both directly and indirectly, either through grants directly to third-party employers. We could prioritize that for low and moderate income workers who face the greatest mismatch between their employment-related health risks and their compensation. And the sectors that they talk about here are healthcare, are grocery and food service workers, education, childcare, sanitation, and transit. So those folks that are in the community that are working in low to moderate income jobs that have faced the highest risk from the COVID-19 pandemic is the area that they've looked at and said, this is where you could provide that service. It is fully additive to a person's wages, and this is the only part of the act that is actually retroactive. It can go back into last year and pay for funds for expenses that were incurred in 2020. Most of the act is prospective, looking forward from March 3rd of this year, looking forward in terms of when the eligible expenses can be reimbursed. The fifth pot of money is for water and sewer infrastructure. This includes improvements to infrastructure such as building and upgrading facilities and transmission, distribution, and storage systems. And the eligible uses align with the EPA's project categories for the Clean Water State Revolving Fund and the Drinking Water State Revolving Fund. So as you know, we just applied for funding through the Clean Water State Revolving Fund. So this would be eligible expenses that we could potentially use these dollars. The last expense was focus on broadband infrastructure. Here they want us to focus on households and businesses that don't have access to broadband and those that have connections that do not provide minimally acceptable speeds. And I think they're looking at 100 megabits per second download and 100 megabits per second upload speeds unless they are impracticable. And this is hopefully to complement some of the broadband investments that may be done from that $10 billion pot, the Capital Projects Fund pot that I mentioned earlier that is eligible for the states. The American Rescue Plan also has a focus on equity. And in what it talks about here is that they provide additional flexibility for communities to use these funds in the hardest hit areas and for those families that have been affected by COVID-19 the most, using it for addressing health disparities, to invest in housing, educational disparities, and to promote healthy childhood environments. They applied this towards our census tracts, and to look at the qualified census tracts that the city has, it is basically everywhere south of McClure would be the census tracts that qualify for the equity-focused services. So these are the 16 census tracts that qualify inside the city of Peoria for that additional flexibility as we look at that. And so what Congress laid out and what they've talked about is what are some of the potential uses of these funds in these areas. Under health disparities, if we wanted to hire community health workers and public health benefits navigators, if we wanted to do lead paint remediation, if we wanted to look at a community violence intervention program, those are all eligible types of expenses for these types of funds. If we wanted to use it in housing in neighborhoods for persons experiencing homelessness, for affordable housing development, for housing vouchers, residential counseling, and navigation assistance, those are all eligible expenses. For educational disparities, we wanted to look at new and expanded early learning services, expanded resources for high poverty school districts, or tutoring and after school programs, those are all eligible expenses. And then for promoting healthy childhood environments, looking at new or expanded high quality childcare, looking at a home visiting program for families with young children, or services for child welfare involved families. Those would all be eligible expenses. Now there are ineligible expenses as part of the act as well. First, anything that changes net tax revenue. So if you were to look at lowering tax revenues, you cannot offset that with American Rescue Plan funds. Second, it talks about extraordinary payments into pension funds are prohibited use of this funding. So under Treasury's interpretation of a deposit that's distinct and different from a payroll contribution, which occurs when employers make payments into pension funds on regular intervals for employees whose wages are an eligible use. So I think that's an important distinction to point out, because if we're using this, I think, for paying the benefit costs of eligible employees, I think that this would be an eligible use of the funds, that we would be able to, because we make our payments into our pension plans on a regular and recurring basis. So, for example, if we were looking at this of saying we were going to apply a portion of this funding towards police and fire costs, we could then apply some of that towards the pension cost as well, because I think that that's a regular and recurring payment that we make. It's not an extraordinary deposit into the funds. In addition, as I mentioned earlier, rainy day funds are ineligible use, as well as funding debt service payments, legal settlements, or judgments. We have auditing and reporting requirements. This slide is really more for Jim and his team because he's the ones that are going to have to do this. We're going to have to supply the federal government with an interim report by August 31st on what our expenses are to date, if any, that we've been spending the funds on. And then we'll have quarterly reports beginning in October, at the end of October, that every quarter we'll have to submit. And all of these funds, as Jim is aware, as our finance director is aware, are subject to the single audit. So we're going to have to report these and show the federal government where these dollars are being spent over the next several years. So this last chart shows you the key dates that we have with this. The pandemic was declared a public health crisis on January 27th of 2020. And then on March 3rd of this year, Congress said for the recovery fund and for these dollars, that is when the covered period begins. There's a deadline of July 9th if we want to provide any comment on this interim final rule to the federal U.S. Department of Treasury. And then the deadline for our first report to the U.S. Treasury is August 31st. Our deadline for our first quarterly financial report and expenditure report is October 31st. And then all recovery funds must be obligated by December 31st of 2024. So we have some time to spend these dollars. We don't have to spend them right away. And by December 31st of 2026 is when all of the dollars have to be spent and all of the accounting has to have been completed for these funds. So in closing, there's a couple of principles that the Government Finance Officers Association gave a presentation to our finance team that they everyone's on webinars these days, and so they sat in on the webinar. But there's a couple of points here that I thought that they did a really nice job of talking about the importance of how we spend these dollars. And this is just advice from the Government Finance Officers Association that I wanted to share with you as we get into the discussion about where we go next. The first is that this funding is temporary. This is not permanent funding. So we should really avoid creating new programs or add-ons that require an additional and ongoing financial commitment, because you're going to create a fiscal cliff if you operationalize all of this expense to the point of where this funding drops off and you now have to make that up with other revenues that we have from our city's coffers to begin with. Second, that we use the fiscal recovery funds to cover operating deficits caused by COVID-19 should be considered temporary. So you can use them, but just make sure that you understand that they're temporary and understand that any additional budget restraint may be necessary to achieve the structural balance in future budget years. Just knowing that these are temporary nature, the temporary nature of this funding. They advise that really looking at investing in critical infrastructure is really well suited for these dollars, because that it's a non-recurring expenditure. As long as there's not a lot of operating expense with that capital investment, that this is something that you should think about and should consider. Second, they talk about scanning and partnering. And here what they really talk about is that we should really look at where the state is investing their American Rescue Plan funding and try and make sure that we're working with them to try and leverage our dollars where we can by working with the state. And then the same at the local level. We have, as I mentioned, the County of Peoria is receiving nearly $35 million of funding. There may be opportunities that we can work in concert and in lockstep with the county where we can maximize an even bigger impact for our community by working and partnering with them as we look at how we can use these dollars. And then their third recommendations were, look, take time. You've got time to be able to think about this. So look at where you can leverage other federal grant opportunities that are coming from, this is only $350 billion. There's another $1.6 trillion that's out there from the federal government that maybe we can look at leveraging those dollars first. So for example, the first pot of money that came in or the first allowable expense pillar that was talking about responding to the COVID-19 mitigation efforts and addressing COVID-19. Well, the health department is receiving a significant amount of funding that's rolling through the state to the health department. Maybe there's opportunities that we look at saying, how do we supplement what you're doing at a very limited basis because you're getting so much money to address the pandemic? The schools are receiving in our community a significant amount of funding that is coming back to our school districts to address the impacts of COVID-19 on our children. And maybe there's just an opportunity to say, how can we help? You've got funding available that you're addressing. Maybe we need to look at what are some of those larger capital investments that we can partner with you, but look at taking those, that you use those dollars first. Ideally, if there's pots that we're eligible for, we're fortunate we've got $23.5 million came to the city right now. There is another $23.5 million we're going to receive from the federal government a year from now. But if there's other pots of money that we can bring back to the city, by all means, we as a staff should be applying for those grants to try and bring even more dollars, more federal dollars back to our community. So that's an important point to make as well. And then I think GFOA talked about the fact that wherever possible, that what we should really think about is spreading out this spending over that 4-year period of time so that you don't spend a lot up front and then you have this big drop off in 2023 or 2024. So try and spread that impact over that full period of time. And then for us, and I was saying this to Deborah earlier, we were in my office talking about this. This may be the first time in my 20 years in Peoria that I can remember where we have this kind of funding coming in from the federal government to be able to spend. And I think that this is a unique situation, and it means that we've got time to really deliberate and think about how best to spend these dollars and maximize the impact of it. And I think that for years we were, whether when I was at the county or now when I've been here at the city, we have been trying to make budget adjustments and to cut. And I think that we're going to have an opportunity where we don't have to do that as we look at the 2022 and 2023 budgets. So with that, we just wanted to put a couple of things out there for you on the table, and then I have a handout that everyone has a copy of in the audience, as well as the council that I'll talk about here in just a second. But first, we built into this budget for 2021 $10 million of borrowing. We haven't issued that debt yet, but that's probably the first recommendation of where we could spend those dollars would be to use these funds to shore up if we have to borrow any money to balance the city's budget. And as I mentioned to you earlier, Jim and I have been looking at the revenues. They're and stronger right now than I think we had anticipated when we put the budget together last fall. So that's good news. But this means that we don't have to borrow. I think that we could use these funds to avoid having to spend not only $10 million to issue debt, but then the $20 million to repay it over time by doing that. Second, our management team since mid-year last year has been taking one unpaid day per year or per month through 2021. I would just ask the council to consider eliminating the furloughs for our unrepresented employees. They're the only group of employees that are taking a pay cut, and we would ask that you would consider that. I think the cost to restore that for the remaining 6 months of the year from July to December would be about $180,000. And then I think that we need to look at, obviously, community and business support, what we can do to grow our tax base. Are there areas we can look at utilizing these dollars to help to bring in more dollars from a tax perspective for the city? What capital projects can we use? Again, using the GFOA guidelines of saying that this is one-time funding, how can we use this to maximize the impact on our community? And as we all know, infrastructure pays forward because you're hiring construction workers. Those construction workers work and live in our community. They take those dollars home and then they spend them back in the community. So there's a ripple effect with those dollars as well. And then obviously targeted expense, operating expense restoration. If there are expenses that you're looking at that we cut, that you would want to look at restoring, that we look at those as well. And then lastly, I do think that the city has time for us to deliberate on how to best use this funding over the next 4 years, and to really look at it strategically, to use it to make investments in our community that will pay long-term dividends. And then lastly with that, just to talk through the handout that's at your desk, Councilman Kelly called today and asked if we could put together just a little summary of what were the expense reductions that were made as part of the budget last year. So on the first page of that stapled handout, you have the general fund budget and then the cuts that were made in our garbage, sewer, and stormwater funds. Those are really the most of the operating expenses that we reduced. And it shows what those expenses were that were reduced in 2020, and then the total annualized expense cuts that we made in 2021. In addition, we also showed where we cut $21 million out of the capital budget. That's on pages 2 and 3 of this handout, so that we have that for you as well. And with that, I'm happy to answer any questions. I think what I'll end up doing is coming back and sitting at the seat over here, and so that we can sit down and I can write notes as well.
Thank you, Mr. Manager. Thank you for also going through this 151-page, not easy reading, kind of small print document. So I've been trying to work my way through, but I encourage all of us to actually pull out your highlighters and eventually make it through all 151 pages. But thank you for going through that, for analyzing everything and putting it together in a PowerPoint presentation. Those are, I think, excellent suggestions that you also have at the end. And I know I have questions, but I'm going to yield the floor to council members that surely have questions of the manager.
City Manager Urick, thank you for your presentation. The way you concised all that and made it digestible, I really appreciate it. I know that we have time to come to a consensus as far as how we want to spend these funds, but do you have a suggested maybe date that we should be looking at of, okay, I know we have time, but it's time for us to start making some decisions so that way we can meet that appropriate window?
There we go. I want to make sure I turn that on. I do think that we have the opportunity to spend the summer, talking about this and use this as an opportunity for it to roll right up into our budget discussion that we'll have in the fall. I think that what we can do tonight is we'll document, and staff's prepared to document the questions that you raised tonight, try and get you answers back, and then have a meeting, whether we want to do that in 3 weeks or at the first meeting in July, if we want to do that then, or the last meeting in June. I'm really open to the council's suggestions about the pace at which we want to go about this. I think we do have time to think through some programming with these dollars that allows us to maybe structure things a little differently as we hear about ideas, or is this an eligible use? We may have to run questions back up through the Treasury Department, but we're more than happy to do that as well. So,
thank you.
Council, excuse me. Speaking of the timeline, there were some things, I think the first 2 items on the suggestions that were more time sensitive. One of them was the furloughs,
yes,
and the other was related to the $10 million debt. So
I think that if council wanted to take those up in the next few weeks, that would be fantastic. I think that they're pretty straightforward. The borrowing that we have, if we just simply avoid that and not spend the money on issuing that debt, allows us to say that we have set aside at least a portion of these funds towards that revenue loss that we're anticipating for this year. And we can point back to 2020 and say that those numbers are an allowable use of those funds. So I think that that's certainly a reasonable approach, and simply for morale for the non-union staff, I would really like to see the furlough issue addressed.
So that 180,000 was estimated
That's 6 months worth of furloughs. I think
Okay.
we estimated last year it was about 362. I'm looking to Jim, but he's writing notes. I think it was about $362,000 is what we anticipated was the full furlough cost. for
Okay, so the
all
6
management.
months would be like July 1st through December 31st?
That's correct.
Okay.
That's correct.
Okay, thank you. Councilman Kelly?
Thank you, Madam Mayor. Mr. Manager, on slide 19, I just want to make sure, which has to do with pensions. I just want to make sure I understand. Are you saying that our regular pension contributions are eligible? And if so, to what extent or for how long or?
Well,
I'm sorry, I'm not saying, are we going to do it or not?
yeah, no.
Just to understand what this is saying.
What that's saying, and this is where I think that we looked at the interpretation that Treasury came out with, is that they said that they viewed Congress's decision to say that pension payments were an extraordinary deposit meant that was over and above and outside what you would normally contribute on an annual basis. What we contribute on an annual basis, we contribute on a regular and recurring basis and make that payment to the pension funds when they're due. It's an annual required contribution, and we make that payment. So under our reading of the statute, we feel that that means that that's an allowable expense.
Thank you. Thank you, Madam Mayor.
You're welcome. Mr. Manager, can you get that verified in writing from the federal government? Because I've heard, we feel, we think.
Well, I think what
We
you're going to
interpret.
get from the federal government will be what's in the guidance, that what's laid out in the guidance is the direction that they're going to give. They're not going to give us a legal opinion about this. What they're going to say is that just what that, because it's in that interim rule, that it says that this isn't if it's part of your annual contributions or your regular payroll contributions, then those can be applied towards that they're eligible expenses.
So it's that clear cut.
Yeah. And within that guidance, what they also give out and what they lay out is that there's very broad discretion for local governments to determine how they want to spend these funds. So they were not we talked about the parameters here today of how we could spend these dollars. That's about as broad as they've laid this out, because they wanted us to have flexibility with how we were going to use these dollars.
I understand. I'm just leery sometimes
Sure.
of, the federal government coming back and de-obligating something that has already been spent.
I think that the other aspect of this that again, money being fungible, is that if we're using these dollars for other governmental services, then the dollars that would have been dedicated towards those services can be shifted elsewhere to cover those pension
Right.
costs, for example.
Right, okay.
Yeah.
Councilmember Seer?
Thank you, Madam Mayor. Just a few questions for City Manager. Number one, these expenses, this is a brand new program, obviously, for everybody. Would they be, or is it possible they'd be denied on a quarterly basis since we have to do quarterly reports?
We have the $23.5 million at hand. What we'll be doing is providing quarterly reports of how we're spending those dollars. If there is an objection from the federal government, then there'll be a process that they'll lay out as to how we would go about resolving how we spend those dollars.
Okay. Second question. Tell me about the furlough a little bit. $180,000 for the next 6 months.
That's correct.
Some of these employees been, their lifestyle been affected negatively already. What about if we go back 6 months? Would that be a qualified expense to reimburse them the time they've lost the last 6 months?
I think you could go back as far as March 3rd. The covered period of this grant is from March 3rd of 2021 forward. I'm not sure that the employees that have been affected by this would be covered for any dates other than that going forward.
Okay. So your ask, though, is for the next 6 months, or did you include
It would be
March?
July through December.
July through December. So we could go back as far as March, if I understand
That is
correctly
correct.
what you said. Okay. Last question. Tell me about the $10 million bond. What's the date? When were you planning on issuing that bond, number one? Number two, what are the costs of that $10 million? Is the cost including the $10 million, or is that can be on top of the $10 million?
Well, so the way that works is we would get $10 million of bond proceeds. The cost would be built into what we would have to repay. So there's probably, for issuing $10 million in bonds, you're probably looking at $400,000 to $500,000 of debt issuance expenses, and then that gets rolled into how much you have to pay back over the next 20 years. We have not issued that debt yet, and ideally, this would be one area that we could use these funds to offset that need to do this.
This is a comment for Madam Mayor. Personally, I'm ready to move forward tonight after my colleagues have asked their question on these two items, if we can. Thank you.
Councilmember Euler?
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman. Councilman Sears' last point was actually what I was going to bring up, is based on how the agenda's laid out, can we take action on those two items tonight?
No, I don't think we can take action tonight, but if, with the direction of council, we can come back at the next meeting and have something ready to go.
Which is next week.
Okay. And so I guess on that topic, I would much prefer to see us go ahead and implement effective June, ending the furloughs. I think we're going into prime time season, or we're already in the middle of prime time season, especially with public works and community development. And I think that it's a disadvantage to us to wait until July to make that move. Thank you.
Thank you. Councilmember Jensen?
Thank you, Madam Mayor. On that point, I also support both using the money for to eliminate the furlough going forward starting in June, as well as using that money to offset the amount we were going to borrow. So please bring that back as soon as you can. A couple questions. I'm wondering, with regards to the suggestions from staff on the second to last slide, are any of are those equal priority for staff and for you, or do you have thoughts on that?
Like I said, this is a unique time, and I think that we have a unique opportunity to think through how we want to use these dollars to be to maximize that impact for the community, to try and use it to be strategic and grow our tax base, and to look if there are areas that we think that I mean you as a body, because I do think this is a true policy decision for council to make, about where you think those dollars would be most impactful on the community. So having said that, I don't think that we do. I think we'd like to, get your questions and dig into them and answer them. Have staff look at those, those eligible pots to see if we can give you some suggestions as well, and bring those back so that we could have another conversation about what would be ways that we could use these dollars appropriately.
Okay, I look forward to seeing what's brought back. Another question I have about using the money for capital projects. Is it eligible to use some of that for some of the CSO that we had planned on doing, and our backlog of stormwater cases that we've had since I've been on the council?
Yeah, that's an absolute allowable expenditure if that's something council wants to
Can
to
you
do.
bring back a figure whenever you do some report backs of what the amount is of the backlog?
Sure.
There used to be somewhere a list of
We have it.
all the projects and where they're located.
It was in the packet of material that we had when we talked about establishing the CSO fee, but we'll pull that information and get it back to you. I just don't remember it off the top
Yeah,
of my
no,
head.
I don't either. I was even thinking what the ballpark was, but if you just bring it back to us, that's fine.
We can do that.
If we were to use some of it for the CSO, though, based on what you presented here, we couldn't then not do the storm water fee increase that we already approved to cover those costs, right?
Well, Now, as far as the capital investments, there is no increase, because remember, you established the CSO fee, but you also reduced the rehabilitation rate. So there's no impact for the first 5 years of borrowing, the way that we've structured the fees for the CSO investments that we've made. So that there is no increase in terms of cost. You established a CSO rate, but at the same time, you lowered the rehabilitation rate.
Right, so is there some way, when you come back with that report back, can you talk about how that could, if we were to use this money to do some of the CSO stuff, how it would work?
Probably mitigate future borrowing is what we would look at.
So then can you give us those figures too? Because I think that's definitely a priority I would like to explore further. The other thing I want to bring up, which I always do, I hope, and I am going to advocate that we have opportunities for meaningful public input on what our priorities should be, how we should be spending this money once we have more ideas of suggestions of what we're going to do. And I hope we'll be able to have some opportunities in public meetings where the public can come and ask questions, give comments, but then also have some kind of process like we have for our budget in the past, where they can fill out surveys or maybe do something like the budget challenge, and also have opportunities besides online and through social media, but also in person, so we can give out surveys at neighborhood meetings and at churches and things like that.
Sure. Happy to.
Okay, and if you would come back then with what maybe the proposed strategy is for doing that.
We can do that.
Okay,
Thanks.
thank you.
Councilmember Ruckriegel?
Thank you, Matt. Is this on? There, is that on?
Yes.
Great. Thank you, Madam Mayor. And I guess let me start by echoing, I think, what we've heard a little bit around the council already, is that I would be ready as well next Tuesday to be able to make that decision on that $10 million of borrowing and also reinstating those furloughs. And I would agree that let's take those back to June 1st. Couple of questions. One, to piggyback on Councilman Jensen's question there. If investments are made in, let's say, the CSO, and those out years beyond what we're seeing up here, proposed increases, there's no harm in possibly not implementing those increases to the extent they are. Is that true?
That's correct.
Okay. All right. So it's just in the years within the structure that we're really talking about that you can't reduce. So an investment made today that might save us from borrowing in the future could ultimately show a rate reduction.
Correct.
Okay.
Or I would call it a rate stabilization versus a reduction.
Better. That's true. Yes. I like that as well. Second of all, on housing, and you mentioned a couple of things: lead abatement on housing, new housing projects that could be there. But we are a city of neighborhoods, and I think something that's come up a lot of times when we talk about housing is rehabilitation as well. It does a couple of things. One, it can increase our tax base, but it also gives economic stability by having houses maybe not cost as much to occupy for some, and it also helps protect the integrity of the neighborhoods. Could you bring back a little bit more in depth about what can and can't be at this point? Can rehab be utilized? What would be the qualifications for that? If we were to decide that, I like to call it the Peoria plan, much more than the Washington, D.C. plan. If we were to devise long-term strategy of what the Peoria plan looks like, what things maybe we could build in there. On numbers and costs that you bring to us, and I think that as other communities are going to be getting these funds as well, and we're seeing this just, I think a couple weeks ago we found that we didn't have a lot of bidders on a project just because everybody's right now is sort of busy. Costs of capital has gone up, capital investments, whether it be lumber, blacktop, and some other things. Will the dollars that you bring to us, the expected dollars, sort of be that future thought dollar versus the dollar of what those costs will come in today?
They're going to have to. I mean, I think we've already seen some bid inflation just in terms of some of the projects we've brought forward. I think we're going to continue to see that with much of the capital investments that we make for the time being. Is that is that not only material costs, but the construction costs are going up. So yes, we'll build that into our projections.
Also, too, on the capital projects, could you, when you bring us those project lists back, could you maybe identify some of those that would be easier to jumpstart? So if we were to move some of those ahead on the timeline so that we can start a couple of those projects beforehand that don't maybe take as much legwork or engineering, we could kind of see that as well so that we can maybe put these dollars to use a little bit quicker. Also, too, along economic, and I think that having a full strategy, and I think this is where working with our other, if it's EDC partners and our county partners, to make for sure that we secure our businesses, again, as you say, to be able to build that long-term tax base. The question I have there, too, is are there opportunities for employment equity as we go forward so that we, and I don't know how this would work, I don't know what plans would look like on this, and so I'm not suggesting, one certain plan, but as we make sure that we have economic opportunities throughout our city, especially some of those where disinvestment has been happening, so that employment opportunities exist for our whole community. And if dollars can be geared towards that in addition in certain ways. And any information you can bring on that would be helpful. Let me see here if on other lists. I'm sure that you're going to get many questions from all of us as council members over the next couple of months, because this is not a one and done sort of 2-hour thing. This is a great, I think, tiptoe into what the future looks like. But a lot of questions coming forward. So I'll probably come back with some questions yet later on today. Thanks.
And we've got plenty of time. We have until
That's true.
8 p.m. Councilmember Riggenbach?
Thank you, Madam Mayor. And thank you, Mr. Manager, and Mr. Scroggins, and all those responsible for putting this together. Clearly, a lot of work has already gone into this. The advantage of going later in the list of colleagues is a lot of my questions have been answered. So I would just reiterate, don't borrow the $10 million, end the furloughs, and going along with Councilman Sear, perhaps looking to see if we could do that back to March even to make that retroactive, restore as much capital as feasible, and get some clarity on the CSO portion of it. I think Councilwoman Jensen was going down the right track there as far as how we can use that on specific CSO projects. So those are things that I think have been said that I'm in total agreement with. But one thing I don't think that's been mentioned yet is the money that we borrowed for the Civic Center. What's the status of that, and how does this affect that?
So the Civic Center, we are finalizing a repayment agreement with the Civic Center that we'll be bringing back to you in the next month that will clarify that the funds that we refinanced earlier this year, that the savings that we accrued to that will accrue to the city, so that reduces the amount that the Civic Center owes the city by about $900,000, and then we'll take that savings over time. The remainder is that we would start that process with them of looking at having them pay interest only until their debt service is done, and then that next year of payment, which would be 2028, they would pay us back in full, is the way that we would look at that. Now, if there are other dollars that they receive that come in that can accelerate that, we'll certainly look at that. As of today, they've borrowed $3 million from the city, and there's still that we authorized up to $4 million that they could borrow.
And I believe I heard on the radio that shows are starting in June, later this month even?
They are beginning the process of rebooking acts, which is great. It's great to see that we're finally starting to see some activity.
Wow. So logic, or 2028 would be that expected time that full loan would be repaid?
That's correct.
On the section about replacement of public sector revenue loss, slide 11 shows that the revenue loss for last year was $18 million, and it was projected to be 21, but you said it could be a bit less. Is there any thought, or has it already been assumed that that 18 million is going to be, how can we replenish that, if you will?
Well, I think that's where we have the flexibility, that we have the flexibility of saying with the first amount of funds, this 23.5 million, in our first look at this, there's these separate sections of the act that you can apply the funding towards. If we were to say we're going to use the public sector revenue loss, you could use up to $18 million of that immediately before we even get to make the calculation for 2021. So I think that we could point to that and say that just based on the 2020 calculation, we could apply $18 million towards our public sector revenue loss.
So before we go like a kid in the candy store on spending this, let's remember that we lost $18 million last year. So that's money that does need to be accounted for some way or other. My final track was, again, on this talking about business support, business and community support. And as we talk about business support, our economic development team, I think, has done an outstanding job this year in reaching out and getting the money available. But would there be some consideration to looking at the Distillery Labs group, for instance, who is that's their mission, is to offer support, to see what kind of partnership we could have with them, to see if that kind of business support would be worth exploring at a little deeper level.
We'd be happy to look into it and get back.
And when it talks about community support, and I can't find the page right off the top of my head, but many of our neighborhood groups, whether it's PCCEO or EBNHS in the East Bluff, I know these groups have been helping people in particular since the rental assistance money has become available, filling out applications and stuff. So let's just also be cognizant of how some of these organizations that are doing great things in the neighborhoods and oftentimes are overlooked. So if there's some way to help them out as well. And that's it for now. Thank you, Madam Mayor.
Thank you. Councilmember Jackson.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. Well, thank you, Mr. City Manager, for explaining these slides. I am glad that we do have some time to figure out how we're going to put this money to best use. I would like, and being new to the council, I may have missed it, but I am not sure if we've fully assessed the nature, the negative impact of COVID on our business community. I've had business people come to me and talk about getting loans, and I have talked about the fact that we were going to get this, but I would be interested if staff could reach out to the chamber or the EDC to get a good assessment of how the business community has been negatively impacted. And to Councilmember Jensen's point, I would also like to hear from the public, because we've had rental assistance and utility programs, but I do know from being employed through the school system that there are so many families that still are negatively and adversely impacted. So I would not want to leave anyone out. So any opportunities we might have for public input to get a full assessment on how residents are impacted, as well as the business community, would certainly help us in our decisions to move forward on how to spend this money adequately. Thank you.
Thank you. Councilmember Graham, and then we're going to cycle back to Councilmember Euler.
Our country, our state, our city is just beginning to emerge from a global pandemic.
play the role of Hannah. We should know where some of the definite needs are already. Just drive around the city and take a look. Take a look at the discussions and the debates which occupied this community as it relates to fire rescue services. And the fact that we have a fire station closed adversely impacting public safety from the northernmost part of our city to the southernmost part of our city, and that would now be the Earlburn House. Take a look at what happened to our Public Works Department when we cut the number of routes, impacting our ability to fight big storms and take care of our people in the neighborhoods. Certainly we don't need to be reminded about that. And certainly as we drive around our city, we shouldn't have to be reminded about the deficiency we have in the area of code enforcement. It's a quasi-police function, but it is a very vital function to maintain the viability of our heritage neighborhoods. When you drive down the street and you see house after house falling in with significant deficiencies in terms of its ability to comport with our code enforcement rules, it means that we need to take a look at our staffing in that particular area and move quickly to stabilize these neighborhoods. People don't want to live in unsafe neighborhoods, and they expect those core basic services that have been cut and dramatically cut because of the pandemic to be restored, and they don't want us sitting around agonizing about how we're going to do that part. The other thing that I see as I make my way around the city is that the needs that are affecting our mentally ill, our substance abuse people, and to a certain extent the homeless people. And I believe that's one area where we can take a look at utilizing some dollars. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm going to say that in part, what we're going to have to do, if we are serious about attacking this homeless and mentally ill population, their problems, and addressing their problems, we have to reach out to the county. And we have to say, county, what about partnering with the city and using Headington Oaks for what it was meant to be part of, a social safety net for our people. It wasn't too long ago that the people, rather overwhelmingly in this community, voted to rebuild something that would replace the falling in Bellwood homes.
Is Mike?
And that became,
Turn on your, I don't think your mic.
I bet they can hear me anyway.
Yeah.
And that became Pennington Oaks. And that was the,
Is it on now? Is the lights on?
it's on. Just tap it, it's on.
You'll be, oh, there we go, my God. Well, you know.
Start all over.
Listen, I was a classroom teacher for enough years that I learned that you have to be able to project. But seriously, our folks went to the polls and they voted to replace Bellwood Nursing Home with Headington Oaks. And Headington Oaks was supposed to be part of our social safety net, just as much as police, fire, public works, and code enforcement. Well, lo and behold, in just a few years of operation, it's not being utilized. And I spoke to the manager about reaching out, and here's where it becomes interesting, but it needs to be done. We need to reach out to our county brothers and sisters and say, what can we do to use that facility? We don't care if it's OSF. We don't care if it's Unity Point. I suppose if it's Unity Point, would be, that would more nearly address the behavioral area. What can we do to use that as the taxpayers intended it for be used? Not to be just sitting over there. What a betrayal to our taxpayers to close that facility and not utilize it for all the needs that we can clearly see. You can drive anywhere in the city and see these people. They are our brothers, sisters, aunts, uncles. Children, and they're everywhere. And I've never seen it this bad before, and neither have you. And that's why I began my presentation with the idea that there's urgency here. I'm not saying we should act foolishly, but we need to move decisively because we've all lived in this community long enough to know that public safety should be number one and the safety of people who are not able to take care of themselves, who need help. So that's where I'm coming from, and I am quite certain that it's Captain Obvious to all of you what I would be saying tonight. And of course, I do appreciate the way we had the lead off with Councilmember Sear, Jensen, Euler, about the furlough aspect, and also the $10 million worth of debt. But these areas need to be attacked immediately because we lost our ability to do the kind of work we needed to do in our neighborhoods with our public works department, with our code enforcement, and certainly fire rescue that affected the entire city. I believe the police department is striving very, very hard to get up to its authorized strength of, what's the number? 219? And I've seen that number go around, folks, like you wouldn't believe. One time it was 250. So I suppose we shouldn't get too apoplectic yet until we can get these people who have applied through the door and out onto the streets. And I think that's the big challenge right now. Would you want to be a police officer right now? So, I mean, we have great challenges before us. And I would urge the council, if I leave you with nothing else, act decisively and act quickly, not foolishly, but you know what the needs are. Thank you.
Welcome. Councilmember Euler.
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman. Mr. Manager, a couple more things. On the CIP list that you provided us of the 21 million in cuts, can you provide us what things out of that list you would suggest that we should be focused on putting back in the budget? I know some of these items were things that we wanted to focus on based on future efficiencies they were going to drive or cost reductions in other places, and I want to make sure we don't lose sight of those. And then could you also give us a list of, if we were to demolish every property in the city that should be demolished, what would that cost look like? I don't think I can even conceptualize that, so I'm not advocating that that's what we need to do, but I'd certainly like to see what that looks like, and so we can have that discussion. I think we've kind of ignored that because that number is probably so big that we've never had the opportunity to deal with it, and this could be some opportunity to do some neighborhood stabilization. And then also, what other things should we be or could we be talking about related to neighborhood stabilization, especially in the East Bluff and the North Valley and the South End, and even some of what I see more recently going on in the Center Bluff? Are there things that we should be talking about doing that can help us look at that picture differently and start to do something different? Thank you.
Welcome. Councilmember Allen?
Thank you, Madam Mayor. Just a point of clarification, City Manager, on this sheet that you sent to us, is there any type of identifier that can tell us, like, if this project has been completed, or was this like a wish list of projects that we didn't even get to dive into?
So these projects were the projects that we just suspended last year. Some were suspended, some were carried over into 2021. We'll provide greater context for you with a follow-up. This was just a quick snapshot to show you where the $21 million that was suspended last year was where those efforts were taken. So.
Thank you. Yeah, I saw Allen Road and I got excited, so that's why I was asking questions. So thank you, Madam Mayor. That's all.
You're welcome. Councilmember Kelly?
Thank you, Madam Mayor. Mr. Manager, going back to that number, the CIP number, we cut by $21 million. Operations, we cut by 3.7 million, I think.
And it was a little more than it. The operational expenses were cut by 3.7, and then in 2021 that was 5.8.
Oh, okay, but just to concentrate on 2020. Okay, so we had about $24 million worth of cuts in 2020. And we're showing a shortfall of revenue of 18 million, which shortfall is not as great as we had anticipated. But we have a pretty substantial gap there between those two numbers, 24 million versus 18, roughly. Mm-hmm. So $6 million. So am I correct in assuming that we've actually built up, or in 2020, year-end 2020, we had built up our reserves by 6 million?
No, maybe I'll ask Director Scroggins to come up to the podium and just talk from this. But we also received $4.4 million of CURES funding that helped to balance the general fund budget. The big difference between what was cut and what was or suspended or what was cut and the budget that was not included, we didn't issue the debt for the CSO first round of funding. So that was 7.4 million of that capital that we had no revenue to go along with that either. So the numbers were closer in terms of what we reduced with what our revenue loss actually was.
Okay.
So, but I don't know, Director, if from a snapshot of year end in terms of maybe just talking about.
Actually, that's satisfactory
okay.
for me. It's not that I don't want to hear from Director Scroggins. I think he's a wonderful guy. But, and then further, it seems that I would just ask the council to be cognizant of the fact that we had $21 million more budgeted originally for Public Works. Public Works is an investment in the city. It serves the whole city. It qualifies under all these qualifications. There was an enormous cut. Percentage-wise, I guess it was second to City Hall, but from a dollar perspective, that was huge. And I would ask us all to really have a look at that, as well as some of these other things. We are not going to have a surplus of money versus the things we need to do. We can't embark on new things. Well, I mean, we can, but we probably should not. We're still not in good shape. And Public Works really took it on the chin. And that means our people are taking it on the chin. And so I'd ask us all to be very cognizant of that in our discussions going forward. Thank you, Madam Mayor.
You're welcome. I'm going to ask Director Scroggins to come to the podium. And if you would speak to fund balance in terms of of where we are currently with fund balance and where we really need to be in order to be kind of in the safer zone.
Working? Okay. We're in the process of completing the 2020 audit right now. Preliminary numbers looks closer to $5 million increase in fund balance for 2020. As the manager indicated, we did receive about $4.8 million from the federal government that reimbursed basically probably 3 months of our police force. That wasn't anticipated when we were cutting the budget last year. So outside of that, we would have probably broke even. We would have done enough cuts and our revenues would have came in fairly closely. With that increase of approximately $5 million, we're going to be in the neighborhood of $9.5 million in our unassigned fund balance. That by policy should be 25% of our expenditures, or roughly $23 million. So we're still short considerably, but we're making progress. 2 years ago, I think we were right around 1.5. So.
Oh, okay, that's better.
So we're making progress, yes.
How long has it been since we've been at 23 million?
Gosh, that's a good question. I do know the answer. It's been like 2013, 14, I think was the last time, but I can get you a definite number on that.
Just estimate it.
Yeah.
Okay, good. Anybody have any questions for Director Scroggins?
Can I just follow up to your
Sure.
question? That 4.8 million you said for police, is that for this next year?
No, we were able to use that for reimbursement purposes to submit to the state through the Cures Act.
Okay, so did we only use it for police, or did we use it? I thought we
That
used
was
it
the
for
maximum
other-
amount we could get, so I just used police. I didn't need any more.
Oh, okay, okay.
If they would have offered more, I would have come up with fire and everybody else too, so.
Okay.
Thank you, Director.
Sure.
I had a question from a city manager's global viewpoint perspective. If you were to identify 2 areas that give us the most pain right now, what would you say? Where are those 2 areas?
Well, I certainly think that the ongoing public safety pension cost growth is the
Outside of
next-
pension.
outside-
That's
okay.
what I meant to say. I'm sorry. Outside of pension. Yeah.
So looking at that, I think there are a couple of points. Obviously, we have the large unfunded mandate of the CSO issue, which is a big unfunded mandate that we have. But second, and this is something that we've been dealing with for the last decade, is that our expense base grows faster than our revenue base. And finding ways that we can grow our tax base so that longer term we're able to grow out of some of these other structural challenges we have is probably the biggest issue that we're
Okay.
facing.
Okay, good. Thank you. Any other questions? Excellent work.
Thank you.
Excellent work. It looks like we have a couple items that we're looking to see on next week's council agenda.
We will bring those back for council's consideration, and we will also begin working on the report backs from all of the items that council has put together. So thank you very much.
You're welcome. I really love the idea about, wow, what happened there? I love the idea about leveraging resources by connecting with other entities, school districts, county, airport authority, whoever else is getting money. This is such a rare opportunity. We'll never see this kind of federal money come through, probably in our lifetime again. And this is not it. There's more coming, so we have to.
I would agree completely, Madam Mayor.
Yeah.
Absolutely. You are correct. This is a unique time.
It is. Okay. And it's during our time, so we get to help make those decisions. So I love the idea about getting additional community input. Maybe we can schedule, some town meetings and get some input in certain topic areas. So, okay.
Mayor,
Yes.
I'd like to kind of piggyback a little bit off what the manager said. We're all looking at ways of growing our Peoria economy and our regional economy. heck, our entire national economy. But if we continue to see the slippage that I'm witnessing in the neighborhoods to the south of Ward Drive, nobody's going to want to live in these neighborhoods, and there'll be no chance of growing out of it, because we're going to see people moving with their feet, voting with their feet, if you will. That's why I bring up core basic service delivery that affects the lives of everybody in this city, but especially some of our heritage neighborhoods where we have so many deficiencies. If nobody wants to live here, or if a lot of people are thinking about moving elsewhere because of these problems that I've touched on and identified, we've lost it. We will have lost the ball game. It'd be very hard to get a lot of growth in employment in the current sectors we have and others, which would involve people living in these parts of our city. And I'll make one thing 100% clear. I've been an at-large councilman, I've worn the at-large hat, and I've been a district councilman. And what diminishes the part of the city to the south of Ward Drive is taking the northern part of our city down with it. So we're going to sink or swim together. And we need to make our decisions quickly. A number of months ago, some people in this room thought it was a laughing matter to talk about a stimulus program that would help the city of Peoria. Heck, I even had a reporter saying, well, that's not going to happen. Well, guess what? It did happen. And we were ready to take a meat axe to the budget that would have virtually destroyed any semblance of livability for the areas to the south of Ward Drive. There were folks trying to stampede us into making precipitous, unwise decisions. Thank God, we held our fire for a long time, longer than I thought we could. So now the time is here. And I felt it was coming, but there were so many things hanging in the balance. There was an election and this and that and so on and so forth. But we're here now, and we must move with urgency to address the problems facing our city. Thank you, Mayor.
You're welcome. Okay, we're going to move on. Madam Clerk?
We are at citizens' opportunity to address the city council and town board, and we have not received any comment cards at this time.
Okay.
So we would be at executive session. So it would be a motion to consider a motion to enter into executive session to discuss 2C3, the selection of a person to fill a public office as defined in the Open Meetings Act, including a vacancy in a public office or the discipline, performance, or removal of the occupant of a public office.
Can I get a motion?
So moved.
Okay, moved and seconded. Okay, is this a roll call?
Yes.
Okay.
Mayor Ali,
Aye.
Councilmember Allen,
Aye.
Councilmember Sear, Councilmember Graham,
Aye.
Councilmember Jackson,
Aye.
Councilmember Jensen,
Aye.
Councilmember Kelly,
Aye.
Councilmember Euler,
Aye.
Councilmember Riggenbach, and Councilmember Ruckriegel.
Okay.
We have a majority.
Okay, all right, and then,
Now we are at adjournment.
okay. Motion, Councilmember Sear, seconded by Councilmember Ruckriegel. Roll call, please.
Mayor Ali,
Yes.
Councilmember Allen,
Yes.
Councilmember Sear, Councilmember Graham,
Aye.
Councilmember Jackson,
Yes.
Councilmember Jensen,
Aye.
Councilmember Kelly,
Aye.
Councilmember Euler,
Aye.
Councilmember Riggenbach, and Councilmember Ruckriegel.
Thank you. How much time do we need? 5, 10 minutes? To go into that, want a break? 5 minutes? Okay, 5 minutes. I'll meet you, the room is right outside to the left. It says boardroom on the door. Thank you. Meeting adjourned.